Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to you by Richard McMahon. He wanted to give a shout out to the founders of the Northwest Animal Rights Network, Darcel Deveraux, Jerry Esterly, and Wayne Johnson. I apologize if I pronounce any of those incorrectly. You can check out the Northwest Animal Rights Network at narn.org. You can also follow them on Twitter at NarnTweet. You can also sponsor an episode. Each episode costs us $10, so that's all we ask. We'll shout out anything you want. We'll be your shills for $10. WhичSidePodcast.com. This is episode 97. This week we're doing something a little bit new. We are been talking about putting out the lecture series, and this will be the very first one in the lecture series that we're putting out. This is a speech Jordan gave on grand jury resistance, so I hope you guys enjoy it. Right now, this week, Jordan is out of town at a prisoner support conference, so you're stuck with just me. September 15th, 1845, 5,000 women cotton workers began to strike for the 10-hour workday in Pennsylvania. If you like these every week, they're pulled out of the Slingshot Personal Organizer. You can get one at any info shop. If you don't have a local info shop and you can't start one, which you should, you can get one at an online info shop like AK Press. I hope you enjoy this episode.
So, before we start, just want to let you know, I recently contributed to a zine called After Prison along with Rod Coronado, Jeff Lurs, and Josh Harper. It is available here on a sliding scale of $2 to $5, and all the proceeds go to prisoner support, so I highly recommend that you check that out. Also, over on the table over there, we're going to have some grand jury resources and grand jury resistance resources, and you can pick up any of those for free. I also have a bunch of my old support stuff left over, and you can have as much of that as you want, because I'm just trying to get rid of it. And, yeah. Also, before we start, here is a voicemail message that you never want to get. If you can't hear it, the words will be on the screen.
Jordan, it's your dad. I just had 2 FBI guys come over here, and they are looking for you. They need to talk to you, and so give me a call, and I'll give you their number. Or at least we need to talk about what they came over for. Anyway, give me a call. Love you. Bye.
So, my name's Jordan Halliday. For those of you that don't know about my case, in 2008, I was approached by the FBI. They were investigating local animal liberation actions that had happened in the area, and it's here locally in Utah. They approached me at my work, and I was very involved in animal rights at the time. I'd helped start the Animal Defense League of Salt Lake City, as well as numerous other campaigns that I was involved with, as well as organizations. And so we'd recently done some anti-vivisection work up at the University of Utah. We'd done some anti-horse carriage campaigns. The newspaper had my name featured in it a couple of times, so it wasn't really that big of a surprise when the FBI approached me. A common tactic for the FBI is to target above-ground activists when they have little or no evidence for underground actions. So, knowing my rights and knowing that I was being unjustly targeted, I essentially told them to fuck off, and they told me that I was going to be subpoenaed if I didn't cooperate. 6 months later, they followed through with that, and in 2009, I was subpoenaed to testify in front of a federal grand jury. I really didn't know a lot about grand juries at that point. Honestly, I was quite ignorant. I'd say that I'd studied just a ton as soon as I got that subpoena, because I wanted to know everything that I could about grand juries. I quickly learned that grand juries are often used to target activist communities as well as to harass and intimidate activists. So, knowing this and knowing that I was being unjustly targeted, I chose to resist the grand jury. And for this, I ended up serving 10 months in prison. I had a very unique case in that I was charged both civilly and criminally for the same act of recalcitrance. And now I'm only the third person in United States history to ever be charged both civilly and criminally for the same act of recalcitrance, for that same act of resistance. My charge was unique in that it was neither felony or a misdemeanor. It was something called sui generis. Now, sui generis is like a bottom of the barrel thing that they just scraped up. It's Latin for neither this or that, or something like that. I don't know. But so I ended up spending 10 months in prison total, and I'm now out. I'm off of parole, and I currently do graphic and web design for a living, and I host a podcast called Which Side. So check that out if you're ever interested. So the first thing that people typically ask me is, what is a grand jury? Well, in the federal legal system, the grand jury is used to decide whether someone should be charged or indicted for a serious crime. The grand jury hears evidence presented by the prosecutor, the U.S. attorney. The grand jury uses subpoenas to gather this evidence. It can subpoena documents, physical evidence, and witnesses to testify. The special federal grand jury, created in 1970, can also be used to investigate possible organized criminal activity rather than a specific crime. Now, I was sort of fortunate in that when I was subpoenaed, I was only subpoenaed as a witness, and I wasn't asked to provide any physical evidence. Here's what a typical grand jury subpoena looks like. I know it's a little bit blurry. You get the gist. And often on the back, it'll also include an addendum, which is an attachment of any evidence that they request that you provide. They can request anything from cell phone records, text messages, chat records, whatever they want. If you don't provide it, then you can be held in contempt of court. So, how is a grand jury different than a trial jury? Well, unlike the petite jury, which is used to determine guilt in a trial, a grand jury consists of 16 to 23 jurors who are not screened for bias. The purpose of a grand jury is not to determine guilt or innocence, but to decide whether there is probable cause to prosecute someone for a felony crime. The grand jury operates in secrecy, and the normal rules of evidence do not apply. The prosecutor runs the proceedings, and no judge is present. Defense lawyers are also not allowed to be present in the grand jury room and cannot present evidence, but may be available outside the room to consult with witnesses. The prosecutor and the grand jury members may not reveal what occurred in the grand jury room, and witnesses cannot obtain a transcript of their testimony. Because of their broad subpoena powers and secretive nature, grand juries have been used by the government to gather information on political movements and to disrupt those movements by causing fear and mistrust. The grand jury lends itself to being used for improper political investigation, due in part to the prosecutor's ability to question witnesses without regard for rules that prohibit irrelevant, unreliable, or unlawfully obtained evidence. Those called before the grand jury may be compelled to answer any question, even those relating to lawful personal and political activities. That information has been used by the government as a basis to conduct further surveillance and disruption of political dissent. When used against political movements, the grand jury causes fear and mistrust, because persons who refuse to answer questions about their First Amendment political activities, friends, and associates, may be jailed for the life of the grand jury, which is up to 18 months. If a witness asserts her Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, she may be forced to accept immunity or go to jail for contempt. Even a witness who attempts to cooperate can be jailed if minor inconsistencies are found in her testimony. Such a perjury charge may stand even when the grand jury fails to hand down any indictment for what it was ostensibly investigating. So all these facts came from Grand Jury Resistance Project. I highly recommend that you check them out. They're a great resource for information about grand juries as well as ways to resist them. So we need to empower ourselves. How do we empower ourselves? To understand the threat and power of grand juries is to empower yourself. And if you can become empowered, you will not feel fear. Without fear, the state and abusive grand jury system cannot do anything to you. So grand juries are impaneled for two purposes: indictment and investigation. Indictment. 99% of cases result in indictment, which is a rubber stamp for the prosecutor, an often necessary step to go to criminal prosecution. An old lawyer's joke used to be that a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich if it wanted to. Because in a grand jury, there is no defense attorney, and you can be indicted for mere hearsay, innuendo, and rumors. In fact, in a recent document released by WikiLeaks, it was stated that if you're the subject of a U.S. grand jury, you have a 99.97% chance of being indicted. Investigation. The prosecutor uses the grand jury as a fishing expedition to collect information, intimidate activists, and create distrust within the movement. When I was called before a grand jury, I was asked a lot of questions that were an obvious attempt at collecting information on me and the community. I was asked about demonstrations I might have organized. I was asked about my friends, possible partners I might have. I was asked about my family. I was even asked if I had a sister that was married to an animal rights activist. I was asked about, like I said, demos that I had organized. I was even asked about a demonstration that was occurring outside of the courthouse at that time to resist grand juries. I was asked if I was a vegan, if I was atheist, if I was anarchist. All these things were an obvious attempt at collecting information on myself, the community, as well as painting a negative picture of myself. So, what makes up a grand jury? There are 16 to 23 jurors, and they're not screened for bias. The grand jury that I was in, I had the full grand jury at 23, and they were seated theater-style classroom seating, all facing towards the center of the room. Next to me was 3-4 people, and to the other side of me was a court reporter, and in the middle of all of us was the prosecutor. The grand jury can also ask questions. Being that it was early, probably, say, March, I had a jacket on at the time, and it was a faux fur jacket. And so, being an animal rights activist, the jury decided to ask me where I got my jacket from, thinking that they were being funny, because it's faux fur. So they can ask anything that they want. The grand juries can last up to 18 months. They usually meet weekly or monthly. Their terms can be extended, but most finish in less than 18 months. And this is done in complete secrecy. So, what's wrong with the grand jury? Well, besides being hell sketch, the witnesses are often subpoenaed for their political views. They don't have to tell you why you were called up, and anyone can be asked about anything. I've heard cases where people are asked what their favorite sexual position is, whether or not they like the color blue, anything that they can do to either intimidate you, harass you, or trip you up and have you answer some questions where you're not answering other questions, are common tactics that grand juries will use. So, two major constitutional rights are denied. Your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You have to talk or you face contempt charges. And also your Sixth Amendment right to a counsel. The prosecutor can call up prosecution-friendly witnesses to make the people getting investigated look guilty, and there's no one to cross-examine them. So you're not entitled to a defense attorney because this isn't a trial, and no defense attorney is allowed in the room. However, in most cases, you can have one outside and go outside to consult with them before answering any questions. For myself, I made sure that I use this right as much as possible. I requested to speak with my lawyer after every question that was asked me. That included my name and where I lived. So, by the time that it got to be my third grand jury, I was subpoenaed to 3 separate grand juries. I was already in shackles in custody at this time, and I had a federal marshal who was in charge of me. So to get me to talk to my lawyer with strict lawyer-client privilege, it required them to take me to the basement of the courthouse in a private room, and it took about 30 minutes between each question for them just to do this. So by the time it got to where I lived, the prosecutor was so frustrated, he actually told me that I didn't have the right to talk to my attorney. I told them that I obviously did, and he got frustrated to a point where he just dismissed the whole grand jury. So, yeah. Make sure you talk to your attorney whenever possible. The normal rules of evidence do not apply. For example, hearsay evidence is allowed. There's no double jeopardy protection. You can be resubpoenaed for the same issue again after the grand jury's term expires. And that's probably one of the scariest things. As long as they're trying to indict someone for a specific action that has remained unsolved, they can subpoena people to testify at a grand jury. And with actions and terrorism enhancements so common today, where there's no statute of limitations to some of the crimes that are out there, you could essentially be subpoenaed to a grand jury for the rest of your life if they're trying to indict someone on something. So how can we resist? Well, the obvious one is not to be around to get subpoenaed. You have to be physically served in the U.S. to be subpoenaed. This is going to be probably the hardest one to do, as you don't always know when a subpoena is coming. In order to get subpoenaed, the federal marshals and the FBI have to be able to identify who you are, and the document has to touch you. That can be either thrown at your feet, it can be shoved in your face, or you can take it from them. If it touches you, it's considered being served. So, I've heard cases where people will flee the country during a grand jury if they know that they're going to be subpoenaed, go camp out in Mexico for a little while, and come back when the grand jury's over. Obviously, like I said, it's hard to know when you're going to get subpoenaed. So if you do get subpoenaed, in my opinion, your next best option would used to be to not show up for the grand jury. If I were to do everything over again, I think this is what I would do. I'd also have a press conference outside the grand jury to publicize it. With my case, I wasn't the only person that was subpoenaed to testify, and we actually had a press release created that we were going to release, and the night before, the other individual called and told me to cancel the press release. And so we ended up not doing that. I ended up instead showing up and reading a pre-written statement to the grand jury. And I think this was sort of effective. The grand jury did ask the prosecutor to step outside of the room so that they could discuss my statement, which really upset the prosecutor. But ultimately, they did end up indicting me. So I'd say small victory there. Your other option is lying. And this is usually a terrible idea. Not this bad. You got to be super wary of lying. A lot of people have been found not guilty of whatever they were originally charged with, but found guilty of perjury for lying to a grand jury. Perjury, or lying under oath, is a felony. Obviously, I can't tell you what to do, but you can be a lot safer just by not talking. So, what can happen? Well, the prosecutor may offer you something called use immunity. And this is where they promise not to use what you say against you. And by offer, I mean they force you to take it because you have no choice in the matter. You could call this useless immunity. It sounds pretty good, but it's not, because they can use whatever you tell them to dig up more dirt on you and your friends. The prosecutor can also use what you tell them to scare your friends into saying stuff about you, because your friends think you sold them out and really you just gave the prosecutor a little information. So basically, they could offer you and your buddy use immunity, and they can't use what you say against you, but they can use what your buddy says against you, and vice versa. So it's pretty useless. Civil contempt. This is pretty common. If you don't fully cooperate, you might get charged with civil contempt. And you're more likely to get charged with civil contempt than with criminal contempt. And that's when the prosecutor puts you in jail to force you to be cooperating. And you can be in jail for 2 weeks to 2 months or longer, possibly the length of the grand jury. There's no set time limit on this. Your lawyer can help shorten this time by filing something that's called a grumbles motion. Essentially, the basic idea is that as soon as it's clear that you're not going to talk no matter what, the judge has to let you out. They can't keep you in jail to punish you, just to force you into cooperating. Now for me, they found a little loophole in this. The fact that I knew my rights and I knew what a grumbles motion was, to them meant that I had faith that I would get out on a grumbles motion, so I wasn't being fully coerced yet. So they kept me in. I didn't know. You can also be charged with something called criminal contempt. And this is pretty rare. It's actually better in some ways. Since it's a criminal charge, you get all the legal protections of someone facing criminal charges. By the time this is resolved, there's a good chance the grand jury will be over, and however, you could get convicted and spend time in jail. I was also charged criminally. I was, at this point, given a lawyer to defend me, and they were able to shorten my time from 16 months to 10 months. But I did ultimately end up spending 10 months in prison. There's also a chance that nothing happens. And the best way to enable this to happen is to ensure that everyone is well informed about grand juries and that everyone is on the same page when it comes to resisting. The old saying that nobody talks, everybody walks totally applies here. Like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't the only person that was subpoenaed to testify. The other person who was subpoenaed to testify unfortunately chose to cooperate, and I feel as a result that might be possibly why they went after me so harshly. I think if you show solidarity, then they know that you're going to stick to your guns and not cooperate. And so I think that since they sensed that this other individual was willing to cooperate, that they could coerce me into cooperating. And when I showed them that there was no chance in hell that I was going to cooperate, that they got upset with this and ended up punishing me as a result. So it's very important that everyone's on the same page. So when I was first subpoenaed, I was really scared. Like I said, I didn't really know anything about it. And I also even thought, what's the harm in testifying if I don't know anything? Well, this is harmful thinking. I was even suggested by members of the local community that they suggested that I do testify because not testifying would ultimately hurt political prisoner campaigns for people who actually committed crimes. Now, this thinking is ridiculous, but not only does it invalidate an unjust system, but it is also validating information that might not be true that the prosecutor is presenting when you're not around. The number one reason, though, and we'll get to that, is that it increases your chances of getting re-subpoenaed in the future, almost certainly. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of resisting? Well, one big advantage to resisting is that you're much less likely to be called before another grand jury. If they know you're going to resist, they're less likely to subpoena you. It's also more difficult for them to put you in jail for civil contempt because you have a track record of resisting. So basically, the earlier you start resisting, the better. It makes it safer and easier for you in the long run. If you cooperate, you may have to testify against your friends many times, and you might get persecuted or prosecuted for perjury if you leave anything out. If you resist consistently, you might get charged with contempt, but you don't ever have to worry about getting a perjury charge, and you're much less likely to ever have to testify before a grand jury again. You protect yourself, your friends, and the movement you're a part of. During the days of the Weather Underground, a grand jury began investigating them in the Bay Area. Every witness read a short statement to the jury, telling them that they wouldn't cooperate and why. The grand jury had to be canceled as a result. Basically, choosing to testify, like I said, puts you on a list of people that they know will talk. It increases your chances of being resubpoenaed and harassed in the future. But above all that, it's a violation of our basic civil and political rights, and it needs to be addressed, resisted, and protested. Basically, we need to create a community and culture of resistance. So the goal of the grand jury, besides harassing and intimidating activists, is to gather information on them, their friends, their family, and the community. So as a community, we should have a similar goal to gather information on the grand jury process. So we will all be prepared to resist its abuse when an agent comes knocking. Another thing that we should do is inform our non-activist friends, family, and coworkers. Help them learn their rights, ask them to not cooperate, and to let you know if they're ever approached or contacted. For in the end, they're just as much a part of our community as we are. And I wish I had taken this advice to heart when I was first subpoenaed, or before that even. Not only were previous coworkers contacted by the FBI, my family was also contacted by the FBI, but even now, I'm guilty of not really letting my coworkers know what rights they have. Sometimes we like to separate our activist life and our working life, but in reality, they're just as much a part of the community. And so, sometimes they might know that you're an activist, and so a good way to bring it up, say you're sitting at a table with your family, and you jokingly say something like, "Hey, Mom and Dad, I'm an environmental activist, and sometimes environmental activists get arrested, so if an FBI agent ever comes knocking at your door, you don't have to talk to him, right?" Like, you're not fully being, serious about it, but you are planting a seed, and hopefully you never have to see if that seed grows into a tree, but it does plant that seed, and I think that it's important that we do that on occasion. If you are ever subpoenaed, you need to lawyer up. You can call the National Lawyers Guild. Their number is 888-NLG-ECO, which is short for Eco Law. There's a number of different committees and projects already set up for activists. There's anything from committees set up for anarchism to animal rights and environmental activism. There's even one set up for internet activism and anonymous. So, totally a great resource. Lawyers are an important part of a lot of people's legal strategy, and the NLG will help you find a radical lawyer almost anywhere in the United States. They helped me find mine here in Utah locally, and that person's still a part of this community. I'm not going to name names or anything, but awesome person. You want to be super careful, though, because some lawyers may give you terrible advice. Lawyers are trained to give their individual client the best defense, often at the expense of everyone else involved. Even political lawyers might not understand that your goal is to defend the movement and your friends as well as yourself. So, if your lawyer tells you to A, cooperate with the grand jury, B, testify against your friends and or the movement, or C, cut off all contact with your friends in the movement, you need to change lawyers immediately. If you've ever received a subpoena or have been threatened to be subpoenaed by law enforcement recently, please let me know, and I will help you get in contact with someone who can help. You also want to make sure to read up. There are tons of resources out there for learning about grand juries. You can check out the materials here, like I said, we'll have some back at the table. Also, some great places to look online. Grand Jury Assistance Project, No Compromise was one that I pretty much just dove through when I got subpoenaed. And Green is the New Red, as well as many more, which are just Google click away. when I was incarcerated, I read a lot about the anti-war group, the Lexington Six, who were jailed for their refusal to cooperate with the grand jury almost a half a century ago. But I still believe what they said holds true today even, and that's that people must mobilize around these issues. To do this, people must first become familiar with the grand jury and its abuses, publicizing the facts and educating others to their rights. Secondly, it's important to engender in others a commitment to the resistance of these abuses, including, but not limited to, one's refusal to testify before the grand jury. Thirdly, it is necessary to keep in mind that while court battles can be fought and sometimes won, these abuses of the law are not abnormalities in a basically good system. They rather illustrate the true intentions of a bad system more openly and graphically than other insidious practices, and this should dominate our thinking as we organize. So, does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Yeah. Well, basically why I said that is because in my case, by me showing up, I was ultimately charged for, they were saying that I was acting, I don't really know how to explain it, but they enhanced my charges a lot. They tried to give me a terrorism enhancement and a bunch of other things that if I just didn't show up, I still have that same intent of not resisting without the physical courtroom testimony evidence to back that up, I guess. So, I mean, it's honestly an individual choice, but personally, that's just what I would do in the future because I feel that my charges were possibly enhanced because I showed up and just showed so much disdain. When I showed up, I might not have taken the whole situation seriously. I did. Has anyone heard of like Dave Chappelle?
Yeah.
So he has this routine in the skit where he pleads the fifth. So when they ask me questions, I would raise my hand and say number 5, or I plead the fifth, stuff like that, and they use that kind of evidence against me. And it was, they were basically saying that I was showing a total disdain and contempt for the court, which I totally was. So they were doing that.
Would they have been able to issue a warrant for your arrest on your non-appearance at some point? Or how would that?
It's possible. They could. I would think that they would be able to issue a warrant on if they're able to indict you for contempt of court by not showing up for court. The grand jury can then indict you for contempt of court, and then they might be able to issue a warrant for that reason.
You said earlier, maybe if you just don't get subpoenaed, then you're pretty much golden. Is there a way that you know that, beforehand that you will be subpoenaed, therefore you should probably leave the country for a bit to a place where you can't get extradited or something?
I guess not really. The only thing I could think about is whether possibly you were involved in an action that had happened that they were investigating, or if friends and associates of yours were being subpoenaed at that time and you had an inkling that you might get one as well. That would maybe be a reason that you might want to wait.
Did you have any clues yourself, or did you just blindside you on your subpoena?
Well, I guess it was pretty apparent because the FBI visited me 6 months earlier and told me that they were going to subpoena me, but I thought it was just a blanket threat that they were just using to scare me. So, I guess so. They told me straight up, yeah, you're going to get subpoenaed.
And so grand juries last 18 months? Or
Yeah, typically they can last up to 18 months.
Do they go any longer?
What?
Do they go any longer?
No, they'll usually end at that point, and then if they're still trying to indict someone for a specific crime, then they might reopen the grand jury, and that's another 18 months, possibly.
So you said that you weren't talking, no comment, pleading the fifth a lot, but you also said that the prosecutor stepped out of the room
Yeah.
and you talked. And I'm curious about what you were saying.
Pretty much, I had a written statement that I provided to the grand jury, and I also, a lot of times they would ask me something, and I would say no comment, or I plead the fifth to everything that was asked of me, and then they'd say something like, "Are you gonna answer this to every question?" And I said, "It depends on what's asked," just because I was being a smartass. But for that, I specifically, he asked me if there's anything I want to say to my fellow peers, the grand jury, and that's when I read my statement. And I actually read it before we even started. I was totally resisting to the point where I wouldn't swear the oath. I told them that I don't swear to God because I'm an atheist. Just a bunch of things just to postpone the grand jury a little bit more. But after that, that's when I read my statement. And I also provided them a copy, and that's when they asked the prosecutor to leave.
Is that statement available?
I think probably not. The gist of it was that that the grand jury has the right to end this grand jury, and that I request that they do so, because that is within the grand juror's powers, is to stop the investigation. So it might be available somewhere, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I had one more question.
Yeah.
That is, I remember going to one of your court cases, and it was just a judge and prosecutor, attorney, and the prosecutor, and then people watching.
Yeah.
And so what point did it actually get? Was it just one court case when the grand jury was actually there? Or was it multiple grand, because that was still considered a grand jury, correct?
Yeah.
So at what point did it cross over into just a judge?
So, well, it's actually separate. But it was the same grand jury that I was called to testify at, was also the same grand jury that indicted me, and so it was all during that 18-month process. I think the point that you showed up was either for when I first went in civilly, because we knew that I was going to go to jail most likely, and so there were people that showed up for that court hearing, and then there was also when I was my sentencing hearings and stuff, when I was going to take it to trial and stuff like that, and that's when there was the other court cases. So I'm not sure which one it was, but it was all under the same grand jury, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
So, you said that there were multiple hearings, right? And so I'm just curious. So I saw you right before they took you away for an indefinite.
So they arrested me?
Yeah.
Okay.
But what I'm curious about is, was every event leading up to that with the grand jury there? Or was it the first one with the grand jury, the second one with the grand jury, and the last two, with the judge? I'm just curious about the process of getting to that.
Yeah, the first one that I showed up for, when they served me my subpoena, it was improperly filled out, and so I put in a motion pro se that I'm going to, that the grand jury isn't justified because the subpoena is invalid, and that was just before the grand jury. They let me out of that grand jury, and then resubpoenaed me 2 weeks later for another grand jury, making sure that they properly filled it out. They had half a dozen FBI agents come in, and that one, midway through the grand jury, they brought me down into the judge's chambers, and she gave me the order that I had to testify, or otherwise I'd be held in contempt of court. And so everything past that, I was, disobeying the judge's order, in their opinion. And so that's when I was actually getting my contempt charges. And then after, they actually scheduled a hearing after that because they knew I was going to resist. And so that's the first hearing with the judge and the prosecutors in it. And then they had another one, I believe, two weeks after that, or possibly during that time, that I was arrested at. That was the one that you were at. So, and then when I was in custody, that's when I was called to the third grand jury. So, yeah.
Did they just send out data to get grand jurors instead of normal jurors? Or, I mean, I know you said that they don't screen for bias, but how do they get people in the first place?
Yeah, I think they send out a typical thing in the mail, like you would normally get for jury duty. The Civil Liberties Defense Center actually has a really good presentation about that specific thing. I'm not as well informed about that side of it. All I know is that the judge can ultimately pick who those jurors are, and in a typical jury, you have a defense attorney who can say, no, I don't want that one, and then the prosecutor says, no, I don't want that one, so that it's more balanced jury. And this isn't the case for a grand jury. It's all the prosecutor's choice. Anybody else?
Yeah. Can you always, do you always have the option to make a statement to the grand jury, or does the prosecutor have to do?
I guess you don't always have the opportunity, but you always have the opportunity to not answer their question and then just instead say your statement. So if they ask you your name, say your statement. So, but yeah, for the most part, I think they'll ask, do you have any questions before it starts, and that's when you can also go into your statement. Yeah.
Did your grand juries indict anybody besides you?
They only indicted me for the contempt, but they did ultimately end up indicting 2 individuals for the actions that they were investigating under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
There's got one more thing to say, and that is, I remember that they used a lot of communication against you at the last hearing.
Yes.
Like you were very public about your disapproval of grand juries and how to resist them. And
Yeah.
It seemed like their whole basis for putting you away was not that you're guilty of what they brought you in for, questioning or whatever, but that you were resisting. And they said that they want to make an example out of you, and that's like the basis for this that they took you away. It sounded that the prosecutor kept driving that home is that like you can't let him go, you have to make an example of him, and I thought that was really great.
Yeah, and that was towards my criminal contempt charges, and that's when it was actually I was going to go to a trial, and so they started presenting evidence, and some point before I was even subpoenaed, they began tapping my phone. I don't know when or where or how. So they used text messages that I'd sent to prove my intent to resist the grand jury, and they had also just statements that I'd written online and stuff like that. And that was a major point for them to prove that my sole intent was to resist that grand jury. Anyone else? All right. Thanks, everybody.
This week you heard David Galore, Raise My Rent. Right now you're listening to Grammatic, Circus. And as always, El Comandantes, which side are you on? Every week we tell you to do this. It's the best thing you can do to help the show without any money. Go rate and review us on iTunes. It's easy, it's simple, and it helps the show a ton. So if you haven't done it yet, just go sign on iTunes, rate and review us. If someone else is signed on, because it's a public computer, just subscribe to the show for them. It's free, and you'll be doing them a solid. Fuck shit down.
Which Side is produced by the Which Side Media Collective.